There's a couple people, or I believe one person that might be missing from that group up there, yeah?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right. So welcome to the Emerging Technologies, Innovation, and Governance Symposium here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center. We are really excited to be here to talk about space exploration as a part of this next panel. And we've had a lot of fun putting together this panel and are looking forward to the discussion. But before we start the panel, space exploration is a very broad field with a lot of innovation across the board. I wanted to start by just setting this scene and talk briefly about the role that Johns Hopkins University has played in some major defining innovations in space exploration over our history. And then we'll talk about the topic of the day. So my name is Jason Callery. I am the executive at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab for Space Formulation. And what we do in the space formulation mission area is we dream up one-of-a-kind, bold, new space science missions for the purpose of expanding our scientific discovery of the solar system, of the Milky Way galaxy, of the universe at large. And APL has been involved in dreaming up these kinds of concepts since its earliest days. Around the time that the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab was set up, many people don't know, but Johns Hopkins took the first picture of Earth from space. Okay, that was done by the university. And about a decade and a half after that, Johns Hopkins University developed space-based assets that basically invented satellite navigation. It was the precursor of modern-day GPS. We've built space science missions that have traveled beyond our solar system, that have gone past Pluto and gone past our solar system to reveal the earliest conditions of our solar system's formation. I want to give you a couple of recent examples. One of our most recent missions is a mission called Parker Solar Probe, NASA's Parker Solar Probe. We designed, developed, built, tested, and operated this $1.5 billion mission. And it was because of innovation and technology at the Johns Hopkins University that we were able to develop the mission. This is a mission that is literally flying through the atmosphere of the sun, studying the sun up close at the source of the solar phenomenon. And there have been more than 800 research papers published from this mission. Last year, we developed, designed a NASA mission called DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. We took a spacecraft, accelerated it at 14,000 miles an hour, and hammered it into an asteroid and moved the asteroid in space, not only demonstrating that we can protect humanity from a space hazard such as an asteroid, but also for the first time, it's an inflection point in space exploration. We, humanity, have rearranged natural celestial objects in the solar system. This is something that's never been done before, and something that I think 50 years from now or 100 years from now, people will look back at being very important. And right now, we're developing a mission at Johns Hopkins called Dragonfly, which is a nuclear-powered dual quadcopter the size of your car. It's going to fly all the way to Saturn, and it's going to fly around on one of the alien moons of Saturn called Titan. This is a moon that has 2 different solvents on its surface. It's a moon that has complex organics, and it's going to bring us one step closer to habitability, prebiotic chemistry, and the search for life in the universe. So Johns Hopkins University's footprint in space exploration, just on the civil space side, which is what I've talked about so far, is incredible and something that we should all be proud of. Those are interesting topics, but one of the hottest fields in space exploration right now is the cislunar domain. And this is an interesting field, both from national security implications and perspectives, but also from exploration and scientific purposes. And in many respects, you could say that we are in the midst right now of a third transformation in space exploration. First transformation, go back to the 1960s. This was the first time that humans began traveling into space on a regular cadence. We took the first steps on the moon by putting humanity on the moon in the 1960s. And also, we invented systems in space that would help our military, such as the satellite navigation system through the transit program. If you fast forward 10, 20 years from there, 1980s, 1990s, I'd say that was a second transformation in space. What happened there was we achieved stable operations in space with our space-based assets. We had an expansion of using those assets for military purposes. For example, think of Desert Storm. We developed bold missions to give us a perspective of what's beyond our solar system, such as the Hubble Space Telescope, which gave us a different vantage point and allowed us to understand how we fit into the grand cosmos that are out there. And also, Johns Hopkins led some innovations to create low-cost missions that performed robotic exploration through our solar system and beyond. And that brings us to today. And today, we're going through that third transformation. And that third transformation includes rapid proliferation of space by commercial industry. Thousands of new companies are getting involved in space exploration, especially in low Earth space exploration, low Earth orbit space exploration, and cislunar space. And by cislunar, I'm referring to the space between Earth and the moon's orbit around Earth, as well as the lunar surface. We're also seeing mega constellations. We're seeing thousands and thousands of satellites being launched into space on a rapid timescale. We're seeing human exploration beyond the moon, long-term sustained presence on the moon, and also plans for human exploration beyond the moon, and increased contested and competitive militarization. So our panel today is going to focus on national security implications of technological innovation, upcoming lunar, human, and science exploration, and we're going to discuss the intersection of security and exploration in the cislunar environment. So this is going to be really exciting, and I'm really excited to be joined by this esteemed panel. So let me introduce our panelists. I'll take a few minutes. These are very distinguished people that have very long biographies. I tried to shrink them down as much as possible, but it'll take me a couple minutes to go through this. So I want to start with Bruce McDonald. Bruce teaches and lectures at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies on nuclear nonproliferation, and also consults on nuclear, military space, and cybersecurity and policy issues. He is the editor and co-author of the 2002 book, Crisis, Stability, in Space, China and Other Challenges. Prior to this, he was a senior director to the 2009 Congressional Strategic Posture Commission led by former Defense Secretaries William Perry and James Schlesinger. He has participated in numerous Track 1.5, Track 2 dialogues with Chinese, Russian, South Korean, and other counterparts, and supported advanced technology program managers at DARPA and in the intelligence community. Bruce has also worked on a range of strategic issues in the Clinton White House, on the National Security Council staff, and in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Bruce has a BSE and an MSc in aerospace engineering. He graduated with honors from Princeton University, also an MPA from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, and he is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Bruce, welcome, and thank you so much for being here and being a part of this. We really appreciate it. Our second panelist is Dr. Greg Miller. Greg is the Dean of Space Education at the United States Space Force and helps oversee the Space Force's professional military education program here at SAIS. He has spent 10 years teaching for the Department of Defense, and he's taught in civil academia for a decade prior to that. Greg received his PhD in political science from the Ohio State University, and his research and teaching interests include international reputation, deterrence, terrorism, strategy, and space. His writings appear in more than a dozen journals, and his most recent book was released by the Naval Institute Press earlier this year and is titled Sun Tzu in Space, What International Relations, History, and Science Fiction Teach Us About the Future. Welcome, Greg. Thanks for being a part of this. Third panelist is my friend, Dr. Patrick Binning. Patrick is the missionary executive for the National Security Space Mission Area at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. He's been in that role since 2016. Among recent accomplishments, Patrick's team developed and delivered the Deep Space Advanced Radar Concept Technology Demonstration for the U.S. Space Force, the Space-Based Killed Assessment hosted payload program for the Missile Defense Agency, and they've also led a specific and critical tabletop exercise for the National Space Defense Center. In 2020, Patrick initiated the Cislunar Security Conference at APL, which is now in its fourth year. This is a premier event that's going to occur next week, and it's going to bring together over 500 attendees from all over federal government, civil space, national security space, industry, and academia to address and discuss the important topic of cislunar security. Prior to joining APL in 2014, Patrick spent 20 years as a federal career civil servant, conducting spacecraft research, development operations, acquisition, and oversight at the Pentagon under the former Undersecretary of Defense for AT&L, the Missile Defense Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, and the National Research Laboratory. Patrick is dual-hatted. He's also the program chair of the Space Systems Engineering Master's Degree Program at the Johns Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering, delivering advanced academic courses to over 600 active degree-seeking students. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Cincinnati and a Master's and a PhD in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome, Patrick. Dr. Wes Furman is our fourth panelist. Wes is a member of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab Space Systems and Analysis Branch. He's a condensed matter physicist by training, has a passion for collaborative and interdisciplinary science. Wes is an expert in research from discovery to utilization for materials by design, characterization, advanced spectroscopy, theory, and device fabrication. At APL, Wes really works at the cross-section of civil and national security space interests, projects related to hypervelocity impact sensing and modeling, advanced materials, lunar, cislunar space, and more. Wes was actually a part of the initial Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative team at APL as a surface power lead, and now he's the overall lead of the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative APL. This is the initiative for NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate that is an engine for developing technologies required to establish a sustained human presence on the moon. Wes has a Bachelor's of Science in Physics from the University of California, Irvine, and a PhD in Physics from Johns Hopkins as a part of the Institute for Quantum Matter. Wes was also an inaugural Schmidt Science Fellow, which is an interdisciplinary research and leadership program in partnership with the Rhodes Trust. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Emma Rainey. Emma is the branch head of the Space Systems and Analysis branch at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. In this role, she oversees over 200 scientists and engineers working in fields that include astrodynamics, space control, applied space research, space systems engineering, space algorithms, and technologies, and also systems engineering. Prior to that, she was a group supervisor of that applied space research group at APL. She also works at the cross-section of national security space and civil space applications and has a proven track record of leading multidisciplinary teams to solve complex problems. Recently, Emma served as the conference chair for that highly successful Cislunar Security Conference that I mentioned. She's also led digital engineering initiatives at APL and has been a prominent member of APL teams, including the DART mission, the Planetary Defense Tabletop Exercise, the SCA mission, and others. Emma has a lot of degrees. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Geophysics and a Bachelor's of Arts in Physics from the University of Minnesota, a Master's of Science in Planetary Science from Caltech, and a PhD in Geophysics and Space Physics from UCLA. Welcome, Emma. Okay, with that, we're going to get the discussion started. It's going to be a question and answer format. I'm going to join the panel on stage. I'm going to ask some questions, and they're going to give us some responses. We're going to take no more than an hour for that, and then we'll open it up. And so as we walk through the topics, if you have questions that come up, please share those with us through the microphones in the last 30 minutes. All right, let's get started. Okay, so the first topic that we're going to get into today as we talk about the intersection of national security, exploration, and science in the cislunar domain is going to be about the why, the purpose for doing this type of space exploration. And we're going to frame up some questions on this related to strategy. So, Greg, I want to start with you. So, Greg, the U.S. right now has many different government agencies, each with their own respective strategies for why we might want to go into space. What do you think that Johns Hopkins University and U.S. Space Force should be promoting as a grand strategy for space?
Is this on? You hear that? Okay. Yeah, thanks, first of all, for having me on the panel. I think I'm the only non-STEM person here, so, but I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to pretend to belong. I'll also do the typical disclaimer as a DoD employee. I'm happy to have you quote me if I say anything quotable, but these are my opinions, not those of the U.S. Space Force or the Department of Defense. One of the things that frustrates me about current space approaches is the lack of a central unifying vision. In the 1960s, Kennedy provided us with a vision to go to the moon. All of our resources were directed towards that, and for good or bad, we beat the Soviets. We don't have that kind of vision today. We don't have a grand strategy at the national level. We have a lot of agency-specific strategies. NASA has a strategy, DoD has a strategy, the Department of Commerce has a strategy, but we don't have a sort of unifying principle for what we're trying to do in space. And I think that's something we need to develop. Maybe a starting point are the sort of Obama's pillars or the national security strategy, enduring interests of prosperity, security, and principles. But the problem with that is each of those agencies have their own definition of what those mean. Right? Prosperity to NASA is different from prosperity for DoD or for the Department of Commerce or the FAA. And so there's not an easy answer, but I think we need to be asking that question And I think that's what our Space Force officers here at Johns Hopkins can be doing, is trying to develop that connection between DoD interest in space and the more national interest in space. And I'm sort of torn in two different directions. As someone who teaches in a military school, a military program, we have to focus on the national security. We have to focus on the things that put our interests at risks. But my own personal view is we pay a little too much attention to the terrestrial, a little too much attention to the national, and not enough to the global interest and the celestial interests. We're looking, DoD in particular, looking too much down at the Earth and not enough out. And so we see a disconnect between what DoD wants from space and what NASA wants from space, and probably even from what the public wants from space. And so I think that's a starting point, is to ask the question, is what is our unifying principle? What do we want to get out of space? What do we want to do in space?
Okay, so thanks, Greg. So let me go to Wes next. So since Greg kind of teed up the differences and perspectives from NASA and DoD and other agencies, so let's talk about the NASA role right now. So one of the biggest things happening at NASA right now is the Artemis program, and NASA is enabling that Artemis program through commercial partnerships and many other partnerships, including international agencies. So Wes, what do you think from the exploration perspective the grand vision should be?
Right. So in some ways, you can come up with a little pithy statement for it. If there's a quote that I'll kind of mangle a little bit, but if humans were meant to have to be a spacefaring species, they would have the moon, and of course we have the moon, right? So our purpose in going to the moon is to become a more spacefaring nation, a more space understanding species, and so we can understand it, I think, in pretty grand or grandiose even terms if you think about it that way. And NASA has spent quite a bit of time trying to distill that and codify it in its Moon to Mars objectives, which is trying to take that longer term vision to it. I think it is a bit remarkable that they're trying to do that. There was, through this past administration change, there was actually not a shift in the Artemis program. We were able to sustain that, and so that offered some very much needed stability for NASA to be able to think long term about this. The science community has actually done this for a long time through the decadal process, but having something like Moon to Mars, which is now sort of an exploration version of the decadal, is starting to build that longer term vision that's much needed, and that's how we'll be able to sustain that. But if you look at Moon to Mars, it's extraordinary what's contained in it. It is just, there's so much that we want to do. It's going to take more than 10 years. It's going to take a long, long time. We're trying to do more now than we did during Apollo, even though we don't have anywhere near the amount of money that we did during that era. And so the only way that we can have any chance of getting there is to bring in all of these different players, right? We need to leverage the technological base that has happened and grown since the Apollo era. And so that I think is the sort of emergent perspective that NASA is really starting to bake into all of its moves, is using commercial, leveraging those translational technologies, also providing on-ramps for commercial entities. So as we expand our operations into the cislunar environment, we can have places where commercial can come and play as well. And I think that's kind of the hope that we have for it, the expansion of our operations as sort of a fundamental aspect of our becoming more spacefaring of a nation.
Okay, thank you, Wes. So Patrick, given your dual-hatted role, I'll ask you two questions. So first, let's talk about the technology side a little bit. We're going to get more into this in the next set of questions. But how has the U.S. developed resiliency in low Earth orbit, and what are some of the technologies that are going to be needed to adapt, or new technologies that are going to be needed to extend that framework up to cislunar domain? And then second, as the program chair for the Space Systems Engineering program in the Whiting School, what should Johns Hopkins' role be in educating the future generation of the U.S. Space Force and how to operate in this domain?
Thank you, Jason. Let me break that obviously into two pieces, the technology piece and the education piece. When you opened the remarks here today, you talked about the third space age and how we are now realizing it's a contested environment. It reminds me of, I think it was Churchill that said the Americans will eventually do the right thing, but only after they've tried every single thing else. And so it's kind of where we are now. We've known for decades that space was going to become more contested. I think the Obama administration really made the first great push into that. The Trump administration continued it, and we're thankful that Biden's administration seems to be understanding that as well. The stand-up of the National Space Council during the Trump administration mattered a lot, and they're continuing that in the current administration. From a technology perspective, I think that's helped a lot as well. There were a lot of interesting ideas 20 plus years ago to how do we do more proliferation? How do we get small satellites into this process? The history has been we need to find exquisite systems because we're only going to get to buy a couple of them. And since we only get to buy a couple of them, they got to have a lot more capability. And since they have a lot more capability, we need to make it more expensive. And if we're going to put that much money into it, we better put more capability in it to make sure it's more useful. And we have a lot of small, really exquisite systems that have become fast, juicy targets. But thankfully, our country is innovative and competitive, and investments have come along in the past decade that have really brought a couple of things into play technology-wise. One is launch. So I remember in March of 2006 with my 4-year-old and 5-year-old watching SpaceX try to get their first launch out of quads in the Falcon 1, and the first one blew up and the second one blew up. But they were committed, and with investment from that equity and those folks that they came across, and now 20 years later, we have a reliable, reusable space vehicle that is dramatically reducing the costs. Other folks are coming into play now, like Rocket Lab and Blue Origin. The launch costs are going to continue to decrease. So from a technology perspective, the access to space and the increased cadence of launch is a huge deal. The second thing I think was a huge deal is the investments, again, commercial investments, venture capital investments, willing to take risk to go build small companies to build small satellites. And so part of what APL has helped over the past couple of years with the Space Force and with agencies like the Space Development Agency to think about how can small satellites bring missions to a more resilient architecture so that there are smaller missions conducting similar performance and advanced performance from what the larger missions used to do. And I think that's the second wave of technology is now we can bring a technology that can be built more rapidly. We're taking more risk. It's showing some great benefits. Even this week, if you paid attention to the news, out of the Space Development Agency, they had a new Link 16 connection where they were able to transmit data into a warfighter system and back into space and low Earth orbit. And these are transformational technologies and communications that are happening. Now, you asked me the second piece is the education side of it. So although it shows up here, Whiting School of Engineering is sort of where my home is. My day job is actually at APL. My night job is with the Whiting School. I'm the program chair of Space Systems Engineering. APL are program chairs for about 22 degrees in the Engineering for Professionals program out of the Whiting School. And by way of background for the Space Systems Engineering program, I've been the chair since 2017. When we took over that program at that point, we had about 100 students in the program. Let me tell you, folks, space is hot. We have 600 degree-seeking students in the program today. We'll graduate over 150 master's degree students each year going forward. We have 22 electives in the program. We're building 11 more new electives in the program. And so Hopkins Whiting School and the EP is really innovative and very agile, and they're allowing us to be able to get new courses in here that are letting us see where's technology going, where do students want to take courses, and recruit instructors to come in to build activities. So it's been a great program. We have a great team. We've had great support from the Whiting School in this activity, and it's clear just by those numbers the impact that the university is having on instructing the nation's new space innovators.
Great. Patrick, Greg, let me get your perspective on this as well, given your role as the Dean for Space Education at the U.S. Space Force.
Yeah, I'm torn again because on the one hand, I think that there's a natural connection, natural link between what our Space Force students are doing and what the Whiting School is doing and what APL is doing, what SAIS is doing. And that's fantastic. One of the things that frustrates me is the tendency to overclassify everything we do in space. And it makes the panel's laughing. It makes everything we do more difficult to discuss in the classroom because even when students have a classification and the faculty have a classification, unless we're in a secure environment, we can't talk about what's going on for real. We can talk about hypotheticals, we can talk about policies, but we can't really get into operations and some of the details. And it also, I think, prohibits our cooperation with allies and partners as much as we would like. And so I think part of what we need to be thinking about with education is not just, what's going on, but being able to communicate about the details of what's going on. My personal view is I'd like to see a little more openness, but I also recognize, again, being in the DoD, that there's a certain level of classification that's required. So it's tricky.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Emma, I want to go to you. So we're going to continue the conversation on U.S. strategy, but let's also bring in some of the policy documents that relate to it. So, for example, a year ago, the White House released the National Cislunar Science and Technology Strategy, and Johns Hopkins University played a role in influencing that strategy through the Cislunar Security Conference and also the Cislunar Security National Technical Vision that was published. So summarize for us 2 or 3 of the most important strategic goals from those documents and the role that Johns Hopkins played in those.
Yes, absolutely. So just to say a few words about the National Cislunar S&T strategy that came out about a year ago, as you mentioned. This was really the first whole of government strategy for the U.S. in cislunar. And it encompassed, a lot of the NASA's Moon to Mars strategy, which already existed that Wes mentioned earlier. But it also incorporated, in addition to the science and exploration, also incorporated security goals and economic development goals. And there's 4 objectives that are laid out in that strategy. I encourage any of you who are interested to read it. It's not a very long document, very, very readable. There's 2 goals that are related to technology development in particular, extending the U.S. space situational awareness capabilities into cislunar, and developing communications and position navigation and timing, or PNT, networks in cislunar. There also is a goal related to supporting research and development and expanding international S&T cooperation. And for in terms of you asked about Hopkins, the role that Hopkins played in influencing this. Hopkins is very well positioned to influence a whole of government strategy like this, because we do kind of serve both civil and national security space communities. Across Hopkins, we are leaders in lunar science. At APL, we have the largest group of lunar scientists of any institution in the world. We're also leaders in lunar technology through efforts like LSII that was mentioned earlier, and in security. You mentioned our Cislunar Security Conference that we're about to host for our 4th year, and I think we're expecting around 400-something attendees at least. It's grown quite a bit over the past few years. So while the National Cislunar S&T strategy was in development, we were able to influence that through our meetings that we held, which included stakeholders from across the cislunar community, through white papers that we wrote. We wrote a specific white paper for the White House on cislunar S&T needs, and our Cislunar Security National Technical Vision that you mentioned. So that's a document that we developed in 2022, which was based on the first 2 years of our Cislunar Security Conference, as well as our own internal to Hopkins studies and analysis. And I think it's very notable in that document, we prominently called out the need for cislunar SSA capabilities and for cislunar comms and PNT as being a foundational infrastructure for cislunar operations, and that was reflected in the national strategy when that came out.
Okay. Thank you, Emma. So Bruce, let's wrap this piece up with a discussion of the why now question. So what do you see as the reason for this renewed interest in space by both government and industry? How are the capabilities and the technologies that are being developed and brought forward going to make it easier for us to explore and exploit space? And at the same time, what are the new challenges that are created through this upsurge in space-based assets?
Sure. Am I on? Yeah. Okay, good. Josh, it's a great question, and I've asked myself that several times over the last few years about what's going on, and there's really a confluence of a number of factors. Because I remember when I was a kid, of quite a while ago, there was a lot of arm waving. Oh, the economic benefits of space, and they would give some marginal suggestions about what was going on. Now there really are any number of good reasons why space has suddenly emerged out of seemingly nowhere to become a really hot issue. And first and foremost is the economics of it. I mean, it's remarkable when you look at for how we launched satellites for a long time. We'd build this big, expensive launcher to throw up a satellite, excuse me, and then we, in essence, throw it away. Well, just being able to reuse a booster, to refurbish and reuse, and some other technological advances has reduced the cost of launching satellites, payloads into orbit by a factor of 20. Not 5 or 10%, but a factor of 20 over the last 10 or so years. At the same time, there's kind of a Moore's law, if you will, applied to building satellites, which involve a lot of electronics. Over the last 10 years or so, that's gone down by a factor of 20. So you put those two together, and the price of launching the satellite and developing the satellite, and of course the satellite becomes more capable and functional, has gone down by the equivalent of a factor of 400. Imagine, there might not be too many people who, when they vacation, regularly fly first class. It would be way too expensive. Imagine if the price of flying first class was less than flying basic coach. I mean, it's suddenly, law of supply and demand. Price goes up, quantity sold goes down. Price goes down, quantity sold goes up. That's, with a vengeance, is what's happened in the space industry over the last 10 years. And at least at this stage, there's no sign of it letting up. The costs are continuing to go down. And the demand for the demand that is generated by that, because new applications, and where you've got legislation that encourages it. NASA had for many years, and we understand why, but it had basically a monopoly on it. And then when we transitioned to the space shuttle, I'm old enough. I worked on the cost-benefit study that NASA sponsored to look at the economic benefits of using the space shuttle. Well, we ended up, the estimate in the cost-benefit study way back when I was in graduate school at Princeton, the estimate was that we'd do 20 to 25 shuttle launches per year. Well, in the best year, NASA only launched had six shuttle missions. So economics has made a huge impact, and suddenly companies have formed because there's lots of economic opportunity out there now. And in fact, so much so that NASA has already said when they basically decommission the International Space Station, they're not going to build a replacement. The demand is so great, they're going to be, as NASA puts it, one more customer for the private space stations that are going to be built. So economics has had a huge impact, and also there's a growing recognition of the importance of space to the military, and the military is rightly worried that because China now has picked up on how important space is to the performance of the U.S. military and to achieving its objectives. So suddenly we have a security problem. So we've got security problems and we've got economic opportunity, and if you go beyond that, you look at again, the government has decided to give up its monopoly on launch, and the Congress passed legislation in 2015, which enables the it enables the ability of the government to indemnify against catastrophic losses, which gives further encouragement to the private sector. So there are all these factors going in that are pushing in the right direction. My only caution on all of this is that we need to make sure that we strike the right balance between over-regulation and under-regulation. And so far, I like the overall the direction that the government and the private sector are taking. We've got to constantly monitor that. But in fact, I'd stack U.S. capabilities against China any day, because one problem with China is that the Communist Party there has a policy of trying to exert greater control over the private sector. You know, China's been economically quite a performer, but the government there in the past has it promoted that. But Xi Jinping, and since he's been in power since early 2013, I think, is trying to exert more control. And you know, the old joke, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." It's kind of that's a bit of the message to the private sector in China. So we'll have to wait and see how all that turns out. But there's this confluence of factors that have been very encouraging to the space, and it shows no signs of stopping.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, so thank you, Bruce. So several perspectives there on the strategy that we need and how Johns Hopkins can shape that strategy, and also some of these new challenges. And we're going to expand on some of the rules and regulations shortly in the discussion. But I want to shift over now and talk about the emerging technologies and innovation part of the symposium. So, you know, let's have a discussion about what some of the technologies are that are going to be needed for the U.S. to play a leadership role in ensuring a peaceful and sustainable use of space, and also what Johns Hopkins University's role should be in that. So Wes, let me start with you. From the perspective of science and human exploration of the moon, what are the critical technologies that we need to develop to establish a sustained presence on the moon's surface, and what role should Johns Hopkins University play in that?
Right. So first of all, we're already hearing some of these all throughout here. It's really great to hear all the conversation. Reading the document from OSTP and like seeing the points that we had in those discussions was fantastic. You're absolutely right, talking about how commercial has phenomenally dropped the costs on here, and that innovation is really driving things forward. And that's kind of true now for all of the ways that we're trying to approach, you know, going back our return to the moon, as I was kind of hinting at before. So if you think about what we're trying to do, go from like the footprint, which was Apollo, to the foothold of sustainable presence on the moon, it's really about building the infrastructure that you need to be able to have return visits to the lunar surface and begin that aggregation of assets, which can lead you to something that maybe looks like a scientific outpost like McMurdo Station. For those of you who are familiar. So starting with that infrastructure, you know, if you imagine you've got your camping trip versus your cabin in the woods, it's going to start with understanding what is there, what you're going into. You got to have your roadmap and know that you can actually get there. So comms, P&T, space situational awareness, all the way down to the surface, I think is important. Space traffic management is really critical in cislunar space, where the orbits are complex, and it's much harder to maintain an awareness of all the actors that are going into that domain. And the places that we want to go on the surface are also quite small. Some of the prime real estate on the moon is, you know, the size of several football fields. There's locations that might be close to prime real estate, but also have good illumination conditions so that we can have power, which is another one of the infrastructure elements that we need, but also access to those resources that could be deep within the permanently shadowed regions. So we also need mobility. So I'm kind of rambling off a few of these infrastructure components, and really you can see across the spectrum all the sorts of things that you would need to do in, you know, a remote outpost where you're doing, say, mining or operations like that. Those are the sorts of things that you need on the lunar surface. And there are also things that the commercial sector has been developing and diving into very deeply over the course of, you know, decades and decades of economic justifications for doing that. So bringing that around to how we want to do this and what Johns Hopkins can do to be a part of it, it's not easy to translate our technologies to such an extreme environment like the lunar surface. And I think, this is something that came up in my mind when you were giving the introduction at the start, that, our quintessential APL is engineering at the ragged edge. We do things like Parker Solar Probe, we do things like DART, we do all sorts of these things which are bringing new capabilities to bear. And it turns out we can actually do that to enable commercial too. If you look at something like Lunar Vertex, which is another mission that we have that's going to the moon, it's going to be integrating several sensors onto a commercial rover. And so having the depth of engineering base that can sort of help all these new players get across the finish line and develop these technology, I think that's a really great spot for us to be in as a lab. I think that, more broadly than that, there's extraordinary efforts that are going to be going on that we'll need to leverage as well across the entire Johns Hopkins family. Humans are only going to be there for a couple weeks. The rest of the time, it's going to be autonomous elements and agents all working together that don't have road signs to tell them how they're going to be safely interacting with each other. We'll need to be able to leverage the expertise of the panel that we had before us. We'll also be able to need to understand how we can actually do that and engage our international partners. So there's a lot of policy that we'll need to bring to bear. So I think that APL has a very clear role in integrating the technologies. I think that we will need help from everybody in the Hopkins family.
Okay, so let me build on that with Emma for a minute. So Emma, living day to day on Earth here is highly dependent on our space-based low Earth orbit communications abilities. If it wasn't for that innovation, most of us would probably not have found 555 Pen this morning. And so as we look to live on the moon and have a sustained presence on the moon, we need robust communications. We need space-based networking. What technology challenges do we have to overcome to get there?
Yeah, and I think both the point that you made and the points that Wes made earlier, emphasizing the importance of these communication and PNT networks as infrastructure, I think is really important for building the kind of capability that we need for a sustained presence in cislunar. I think one of the key things that we need to think about here is that when given the broad number of international commercial actors that are intending to go into cislunar, we don't want each of them to bring their own nav system that all work independently of each other. That is just not an efficient way to operate in cislunar space. So, we need to think about communications and PNT architectures that will have for one thing, the capacity to handle the kinds of data rates and, with potential delays and so forth, the routing problem, et cetera, for multiple missions operating simultaneously in cislunar space. That's an important part of it. But building a system that is, emphasizes scalability and interoperability is another important component that we need to consider. And I think the LEO networking is a great example of how this works. If somebody sends up a satellite now, they don't need to bring their own nav. I think the presence of that infrastructure, in addition to the launch that Bruce mentioned earlier, has really enabled the space boom that we're living in today. We would not have the degree of space boom that we have today without that foundational infrastructure. So, in terms of the challenges of doing something like that in cislunar, there is a technology challenge in that we can't just take the same network that we use in LEO and expand it up to cislunar. The networking protocols and algorithms won't work effectively in cislunar. So there's a technology challenge in terms of developing the hardware and software that we need for cislunar networking. And then there's also a challenge, which is, maybe part technology, part policy in terms of developing standards and protocols that can be adopted across the community to enable that an open, secure, interoperable cislunar network. And I'll add, this is an area that we are actively investing in Hopkins today. We are working with the community on developing standards. We are investing in research, developing hardware and software for cislunar networking. And we're working with government sponsors as well as new space companies looking at opportunities to demonstrate these capabilities in the near future and then eventually transition to industry for operations.
So let's take a shift now, a strong shift into some of the national security interests here. So I'll start with Bruce, and then we'll hear from Patrick, and then Greg. So Bruce, while there are many international partners that are working closely with the U.S. On collaborative space programs, we also have countries with other interests in mind that may not align with the U.S. and its allies. So what are some of the Chinese interests in cislunar and lunar space from a technology perspective, and what countermeasures do we need to establish to ensure space is being used for peaceful purposes?
Well, China has come out of not quite, but almost nowhere. For a long time, the big threat was first the Soviet threat, and then now the Russian threat. But China's sort of economic miracle has given them a lot of capability. And sadly, with the rise to power of Xi Jinping, he's taken a more authoritarian bent, which has posed a serious problem. China, really the world woke up and took notice when China conducted its first anti-satellite test in January of 2007. It was particularly startling to me because I had been in China and met with some national security leaders over there in November of 2006, and this was we had seen the direction they were going, but we didn't expect it to be demonstrated so dramatically. And one thing it certainly alerted people to is the problem of space debris. The Chinese ASAT test created over 3,000 pieces of debris, most of which 10 centimeters in diameter or bigger, most of which are still in orbit. And creating a problem. And in fact, there have been several collisions with those. But it certainly announced to the world that we face a problem, because of course the United States is very dependent on its space-based capabilities for sensing and other technical tasks, and it showed how vulnerable we are, and most important, it showed that China understood, the PLA understood all too well the value of our space capabilities to make our military the most effective fighting force in the world. And suddenly it looks like there became a threat. And this is, thank goodness we've got technologies that are helpful to us. For a long time, we've been very dependent on early warning and reconnaissance satellites at geo levels, orbital altitudes, and it suddenly, as General Hyten rather colorfully put it a couple of years ago, we keep putting up these big, fat, juicy targets for China potentially to shoot at, and but I'm glad to see that Space Force and Air Force have gotten the message, and now there's a big emphasis on disaggregation to take, instead of having a few highly complex and very highly expensive systems, of disaggregating it so that you have multiple, maybe hundreds of satellites that perform the same function, but they're so numerous that hitting or negating several of those might degrade your capabilities some, but it wouldn't degrade our capabilities anything like the extent of having just a few large, sophisticated satellites that China has already demonstrated that they can target, and but so that the idea of disaggregating is important, and also now one thing though that I'd like to see more discussion of that has not been there is that you could accuse the Chinese of being many things, but stupid they're not. and clearly they're going to try to figure out countermeasures to our countermeasure, and we need to be on top of that. And I would welcome some discussion about countermeasures that we could take to what they're doing, because the United States is so very dependent on our space-based capabilities. And I hope that, and I'm sure that China is working on that, and we need to be prepared to deal with that. And here we're going to be very dependent on our superior technology. I still believe that the United States, I've read some doom and gloom analyses of, oh, China's going to surpass us. I still have faith and confidence in our space capabilities, and I think we can rise to the challenge. We also have, let's see, the other one is, we need to be able to develop better ways of countering what they're doing at the same time. I'm one who thinks that it's a radical proposal, but we derive more benefit from space, I think, than anybody. So to me, it would make sense, just as a diplomatic move, to suggest to China that we do some kind of a no first use policy of space weapons. The United States, we derive so much benefit from our space capabilities. We certainly need to be prepared to respond, and we want to be able to deter China, but we should not want to get into, I think U.S. interests are best served if we can avoid getting into a shooting war, and the best way to do that is to maintain a capability that, I love it, again, I admire him a lot too. General Hyten said when it came to nuclear weapons, I think the same thing applies to space, which is you want your adversary to wake up in the morning and saying, nope, I can't do it. Today's not the day to do it. And we do, and we have a tremendous capability to deter them. And one thing that helps a lot is, in a way that we are way ahead of China, is we have multiple alliances that will assure that China knows that, or any other country would know, that if attacking United States satellites, you're not just attacking the United States, you'd be attacking all the countries of NATO, Japan, all the U.S. alliances, so that when it comes to burden sharing, which is a big issue in foreign policy, of course, is that has in my view, it will have a significant deterrent effect. So with technology and with our alliances, we should be able to continue to be preeminent in space.
Thank you, Bruce. So Patrick, same question for you. What do we know about our adversaries and their interests, and what should Johns Hopkins University be doing to ensure U.S. leadership in this contested domain?
In this contested domain, so I'm not confident it's actually contested. I definitely would say it's competitive. That's not a bad thing. Our country's competitive. We like competition. We strive in competition, I think, in our country. I think when we think about the technologies and going forward, I equate back to something you had said earlier about GPS. You probably couldn't have gotten here without GPS on your phone because you didn't know how to drive to 555 Pennsylvania Avenue. Well, I took an Uber here. So Uber knew where I was. The Uber driver knew where he was. Uber driver knew where all the other Uber drivers were. And he knew where all the other people looking for Uber drivers were. And he knew where everybody was going. So this whole system has been set up on the ground to let everybody know what's going on. When I'm not taking an Uber, I use the app Waze. Like if you live in DC and you're not using Waze, you're missing out because you got to use that tool to navigate around the traffic. Waze knows where everybody is and how fast people are going and can navigate you around it. I'm also a Tesla owner, and if you're a Tesla owner, they're getting more and more optimized in sort of how they make people do long trips and who's going to which chargers and how long are they going to be there, and this whole thing is getting optimized. So kind of my point in this is if there's transparency in the system and the data is in the system can be optimized either for safety or for efficiency. And I think something similar to that could be thought about in the cislunar environment. Cislunar is like enormously voluminous. You're talking 2,000 times more volume than the volume just between geostationary orbit, 22,000 miles, and the Earth. It's larger than 10 times farther away than geostationary orbit. This is an enormous amount of literal space to kind of track and see what's happening on there. And astrodynamics is an awesome thing to study. It's well known as you move between the Earth and the Moon, there are really specific corridors for people to move in and out, like to make it efficient to transfer back and forth. So these roads are sort of known between the Earth and the Moon. The volume is enormous. The DoD recognized it's hard to find objects in Earth orbit, and so a couple programs were started to help do that. The Space Force started the Deep Space Advanced Radar Concept Program to help use radar energy to find objects in geo. They partnered to do the Silent Barker program to look for other objects in that domain. But cislunar and lunar is so much farther away from the Earth-based sensors and space-based sensors are not effective. So trying to come up with and using today's sensor technology to do this transparency in where is everybody going, I don't think is going to be a very viable approach. The place I was going in this is what is the approach to kind of ensure that this competitive environment does not get contested is in transparency. Where are people going? What maneuvers are they making? And I've been thinking about this problem in the following way, that can we, through whichever mechanism, get people to agree? Tell me where you are and where you're going, because it's a very difficult process to figure that out on your own. Even if you know where somebody is and what direction they're traveling, it does not take a lot to radically change where you're going. So if we had something similar to what Uber has, or what Waze has, or what Tesla has, where folks just let people know where they are, let people know where they're going. There are some estimates that I've seen that there are over 100 missions planned in the next 5 or 10 years to the moon. That's an enormous amount of traffic that is not prepared to be going down these corridors back and forth. So I think some way of sharing this data, people are going to know where they are, they're going to know what their maneuvers are, they're going to know where they're going. We need to find a way to share that data so that folks can have transparency in the system so that we don't get into a competitive environment, a contested environment, but stay just in the competitive environment.
Sounds wonderful. I love it. Seems easier said than done, but I like it. So Greg, last question on this topic. So let's turn this around a little bit. Let's say we do develop some of these critical technologies that are in the U.S. interest. What could be some of the risks that are associated with that, including implications for national security and international stability?
Yeah, so one of the big ideas we teach in the Space Force cohort is strategic thinking, which is critical thinking, creative thinking, but also asking what comes next. And I think that's an important question that we need to be asking with respect to space is, let's say we develop these technologies. Let's say we have a permanent presence on the moon. Who governs it? Who enforces the rules? Is it the country where the crew comes from? Is it the company where it comes from? You know, is it whoever gets there first, whether it's a democratic state or an authoritarian state? You know, these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be thinking about more, and potential risks or the follow-ons to the successful technologies. And we see this after the Apollo missions, right? We got to the moon, we beat the Soviets, and we weren't asking the question, what comes next? And that's why I think we got kind of a stunted space program for a while. The risk part to me, I think, is not so much the technologies themselves, but how they're used. A lot of the technologies that are being developed right now that are mostly benevolent can have malevolent purposes. We talk about space debris cleanup. Almost everything I have seen that is talking about how to clean up space debris can also be used as a weapon, whether it's a net, a harpoon, a huge vacuum. These are all things that if you develop it, you can also use against other spacecraft. So I think those are kind of the big risks that we need to be thinking about. The what comes next, what are the unintended consequences of what we're trying to do. But then I think there's also a public opinion, political will risk to a lot of this. On the one hand, the public tends to over-exaggerate what we spend on space, like way overestimate. but we tend to be underwhelmed or not informed enough on what space provides to the public. And so there's a tendency when budgets get tight or when there's other priorities, or if billionaires decide to take their money and go home, is there going to be the funding for these kinds of technologies, or are we going to get another lull in space? I think that's a potential risk. We need to convince the public that there's a benefit to space, a tangible benefit to space that is worth the cost. But there's sort of an additional part to this. I think there's a risk if we don't make space accessible to the average person at some point, the public is going to lose interest. On the other hand, if we make it accessible to the average person, then all of humanity's flaws and tensions and conflicts are going to make their way into space too. And we're seeing that, the price of entry into space is going down. What that means is more bad actors can get involved in space. And whether it's a non-state actor or a country, a rogue state, whatever term you want to use, I think there's a risk of that we need to be cognizant of. And I think Space Force is thinking about that. I'm not sure they're thinking about what comes next if we get to the moon, who governs, who protects, who provides security, those types of issues.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So let's expand on that, and let's just spend about 5 minutes on governance, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let me ask all of the panelists to limit their responses to about a minute, and I'll just call on a couple of you. And so, yeah, I agree. So the lack of governance for cislunar exploration and security is striking. Space is a little bit like the wild, wild west right now. And so let's talk about the progress that's needed in governance and also from the international angle. So Bruce, let me start with you. So Bruce, can you give us an example or two of where the lack of governance can lead to a misunderstanding? Especially maybe consider this from the perspective of someone who gets there first, and what claim can they make? What claim can they stake as a result?
It's to my mind, it's one of the biggest open questions and a source of potential problems. I was really taken. I saw reading a news article a couple of weeks ago that a big new area in the legal world is space law. If you know lawyers, like I know lawyers, anytime you see lawyers running in a certain direction, there's got to be money at the end of where the trail lines. And I saw DLA Piper was openly telling the world that they have launched a space practice, and on the West Coast and overseas, and so that there's something there. There's the laws of that have to do with property rights. How do you define property rights in space? The one thing the Outer Space Treaty is very clear about is that no country, all the signatories agreed that they cannot claim sovereignty rights on celestial objects, which you think is good. But there are ways that countries might try to get around it. For example, you say, I'm not claiming sovereignty rights. However, we're going to be doing operations, mining operations, or looking for ice in these regions, and you got to check with us before you have to get our permission before you can operate in that area, because in the meantime, we're pushing pedal to the metal to mine as much of those rare earth elements that might be there. So, and there is, in fact, China has openly expressed interest. They're speaking of the cislunar opportunities. They've already identified they want to establish a cislunar economic zone, so I don't know about you, but I'm made a little bit uncomfortable by the idea of China getting there first and establishing an economic zone where we might end up having to get their permission in order to do any of our operations there. But the thing of it is, it's an unresolved question, and to me that it's something that there's got to be a reasonable way that reasonable countries and reasonable people could reach some kind of a compromise, maybe limit the size, agree to a limit on the size that you can claim even just exclusive operating rights for a limited period of time. There's a number of problems, governance problems, that need to be addressed, and there have been some attempts at the United Nations to do this, but they haven't been very successful. So we have a real problem. There are long-term issues. Again, who makes the rules? We've been spectacularly unsuccessful in just even agreeing in the United Nations to consider this issue. And you can imagine, you remember, in fact, I oftentimes, for analogies, I like to go back to the Lewis and Clark expedition. You may remember that, where President Jefferson, very farsighted, when the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million, great bargain. I don't think we're going to see a deal like that coming up again anytime soon, but was first to explore what's out there so that we know what we were dealing with, and the need to agree on operating rules so that are fairly agreed to. But so far, China's been reluctant to do that, and they're making an all-out effort in cislunar that if we're not careful, they will try to claim squatters' rights. And I'm not saying they're going to do that, but I hate the thought that we might find ourselves in that situation. So we have a number of issues that we need to address in governance. For example, the issue of numbers of satellites. I mean, I was looking through some old papers, and I saw a projection of the number of satellites in low Earth orbit projected forward, and it would show a fairly gradually rising line. Well, to put that in perspective, at about 1,000, maybe going up to 1,500 functioning satellites. Today, there used to be about 1,100 satellites in orbit about 10 years ago, functioning. There are now 8,500. The projection is by 2030, there will be an additional 30,000 satellites in orbit. And by 2040, if you're ready, hold on to your hat, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million satellites. Now, just imagine the possibilities for collisions. In fact, in terms of collisions, the estimate is that by 2040, there will be, on a daily basis, 25,000 close calls of satellites running into each other. So there are a huge number of governance issues that need urgent attention, and we need to somehow get jump-started on dealing with these problems. I could go on for more, but I'll shut up for right now.
Thank you, Bruce. So let me ask folks that have questions to start lining up at the microphones. And Patrick, I'm going to give you the last word on this and just continue some of the national security implications. So, the Chinese are already on the far side of the moon. What do we know about what they're doing there? And from some perspectives, is it already too late when it comes to governance? And second, if we do establish rules and regulations, will they even abide by them?
The U.S. has not soft landed on the moon in like 50 years. We did a crash landing in 2009 to look for water, and the next soft landing is going to launch here in a month. The Chinese plan has been really impressive to watch what they're doing. They're impressive planning. They're impressive technologically. They're doing impressive work systematically to just move forward in how they operate and understand and learn on the moon. Their engineering is phenomenal. So just to highlight the recent accomplishment that they did, they returned a lunar sample to Earth, but their whole process was just really, really impressive. To go to the far side of the moon, you can't communicate from Earth to the far side of the moon because the radio waves can't go through the moon. So in preparation for that, they deployed a communication satellite on the far side of the moon, moving around one of these fancy points called a Lagrange point, tested that out before they did their launch. Chang'e 5 was the mission, and they launched that a couple of years ago. soft landed a rover on the backside of the moon, took a sample, put that sample into a return capsule, redocked to the spacecraft in lunar orbit, returned that spacecraft, dropped off the capsule into Earth orbit so it landed safely on Earth, and then that spacecraft then is doing maneuvers in deep space. So they're practicing how to operate in deep space. They're practicing all these engineering challenges, and they're doing a phenomenal and fantastic job engineering-wise, and they have plans on how they want to keep moving forward in those aspects of it. You know, to the question about governance and those types of things, you know, I certainly think that the American democratic way of having transparency and a rules-based order is a better way to go about doing it. I think competitors and authoritarian folks that go down that path, you know, what I don't think we want to have is what has happened in the South China Sea. You talked about the cislunar economic exclusion zone activities and what they're doing in the South China Sea. I don't think we want to see those behaviors exist in cislunar space. I'm not confident I know how we go about doing that. I'll be happy to engineer some spacecraft for us to go find what's going on out there, but I think it looks like it could be a very difficult challenge going forward.
Okay, fair enough. All right, great. Thank you, panel. We'll come back to this in a minute, but let's start taking some audience questions. We're going to treat this as a lightning round, so no ands or follow-on questions, and panelists are going to give quick responses. So we'll start over here.
Hi, I'm Kimberly King from the Aerospace Corporation. Adding to the risk, so ASATs are easily attributable, they're expensive, so I don't really think an ASAT is probably going to be our biggest problem. Disaggregation is great in terms of that. What isn't so good is cyber attacks because you have common code bases, and it is hard to attribute, and we currently are moving more towards commercial. And they have very little incentive to do cybersecurity on those space vehicles and ground stations. And I just feel like this is one of the big risks we need to address. So I don't know if you have any ideas on how to do that, but.
Yeah, so it's a great point. It's something that we didn't discuss and we didn't bring up. Does anybody want to say anything on the importance of cyber resiliency?
I agree. And I don't know that I have anything to add to your point with going to so many kind of commercially procured systems, and that's a downside of standards, right? Is it's out there, and your hackers have kind of a starting point to work with. So cybersecurity is absolutely something that we have to think a lot about.
I wasn't sure whether you addressed the issue of the space junk and the space congestion with all the new players and the new microsats up there compared to the old fewer, bigger, old-fashioned, sats that, were much fewer of them, Is there, how we address that issue by getting rid of the junk up there and stuff and the congestion with all the new players? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's, go ahead.
Well, the only thing I would offer there is, at least the way that we govern this in our country, folks that do small sat development, there's a requirement to ensure that they've got the maneuverability to have a deorbit capability in 25 years. So no matter what their size are, we need to ensure we follow that process. That's not commonly done worldwide. And so these proliferations, these small sat architectures that are going on out there, they need the capability. We need to ensure they have the capability to naturally deorbit over some period of time so that there is not a continually in perpetuity proliferation of space junk out there in non-functioning systems.
Yeah, Patrick, in fact, I think they reduced it now to 5 years. It was 25 years, and they're now down to 5 years for when it has to be able to be deorbited.
Yeah.
I'll just add, since we have a cislunar theme on our panel, that would look very different in the lunar environment where we don't have an atmosphere. So that's an important thing to think about.
Well, no. Okay, so this is, I said I wouldn't do this, but the risks of doing this is all of a sudden you're now polluting the upper atmosphere with lots and lots of metal from these spacecraft, and people are starting to study what the implications to our planet might be from doing that as well. So we need to be conscious of that also.
Yeah.
Hi, name's Robert Sumner. I work for the MITRE Corporation. Playing off the cybersecurity theme, you spoke about the rise of economic opportunity and the rising security problems from state actors. However, non-state actors, as we've seen with commercial internet, have proven to be a persistent and legitimate threat to multiple systems. So my question would be, how will non-state actors' threats drive the future changes to the international space ecosystem?
I mean, that's not a new thing. We've seen hacking of Intelsat 15 years ago, AsiaSat 10 years ago, by non-state actors, terrorist groups like the Tamil Tigers, the Falun Gong in China. I mean, we've seen that for a while, especially in the cyber domain. And so I think we'll continue to see that. And this gets back to my concern about making it accessible to everybody. The cheaper we make it, the easier it is for non-state actors to do nefarious things. And I think right now there's still a high end of a threshold that we're not going to see activity from space to space. We'll see it in the cyber domain. We'll see it from ground to space, maybe. And it's still, I think the threshold is still high enough that we're not going to see satellites from non-state actors for a little while. But I mean, that's probably coming too.
Thank you, Greg. Over here.
This question's for Greg. You mentioned very early in your talk about a vision or the lack of a vision. And I go on YouTube probably at least once a month, to listen to JFK's moon speech that he made at Rice University in 1962. And I'm just fascinated with what he said then, because I think it's still apparent even in today's world, 60 years later. The competitive vision here, we're talking about the moon. You know, I was transfixed as a kid when man chose to get to the moon. And the second transformation, I lost total interest. I didn't care. I don't care about the space shuttle. The third transformation, on the other hand, going to the moon again by a manned space exploration, or even going to Mars. I want to go to Mars. I want to go to Saturn. I mean, you know, that's to me is the vision. So if you can talk to me more about the vision of what the Space Force is adapting to, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'm with you. One of my biggest disappointments in life is I have not seen a person walk on the moon. The last person to leave the moon did so 2 months before I was born. And I've been waiting for that patiently. I spent the first 15 years of my academic career studying terrorism, and that got to be incredibly depressing, and I needed something a little more uplifting, so I went back to studying space. And I'm still waiting for that vision, that Kennedy-esque vision. My concern, I'll criticize Kennedy in this one respect. We got to the moon to beat the Soviets, not to make it a step towards something else. And my concern with let's get to Mars is, are we asking to do what, right? What's the broader vision of that? Because we could do it. We could do it relatively easily, relatively soon with the technology we have, but do we learn anything from it? Do we develop any expertise, any governance, any policies that allow us to continue to do more? To me, that's the heart of a grand strategy. Is there's not a theory of victory or theory of success. There's not an endpoint. It's you're propelling yourself towards a vision, but there's something beyond that as well. And so I don't know what that is. I've yet to hear it. I'm not smart enough to put it together. Maybe it's as simple as exploration for exploration's sake. I don't know that that's enough to convince the American public to pay taxes to do it, but I don't know. I'm with you. I'm waiting for it.
Wes?
Just a quick positive spin on it. I think the moon is the one place that anyone on Earth can see that we have the capability to reach, and there is a profound need for things that are as unifying as that objective. It changes the scope of human experience, and I think that you can see it reflected, it's part of what it means to be human. It's part of what it means to be alive on this planet. The moon is tied to us in our physiology in a deep, deep way. It is a part of all of us. And it's something that I think that if we can tie into that and recognize that almost everybody on the planet has some connection like that, every culture has some connection to that. I think that is where it lies. It's the expansion of human experience, and we see our values reflected in the things that we fund and we prioritize. So that keeping us healthier, safer, happier, those are number one. Bringing us together, that's number two, and expanding the scope of human experience is number three. And I think the moon hits all of those really hard, especially 2 and 3.
Awesome, thank you. And I've got something for you as well, but I'm determined to get through these questions, and so come see me after the panel.
Okay. Hi, my name is Navina Rodas. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Maryland and also tech enthusiast. I want to pose this question to Greg. I know you've been in the hot seat for a couple of minutes, but I want to pose it to other panelists as well. I know you briefly mentioned, Greg, about having space like travel being more accessible to the general public. And I want to ask, in terms of having that, like, how do you, like, what initiatives do you, like, kind of build in, like, upkeeping, like, equitable and sustainable, like, routes of having, like, space travel being accommodated to more of a general public, and also keeping in mind of, like, different vulnerabilities in that sort of sense?
So one of the things that I think the opportunities we are missing right now is I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to do the political thing and answer the question I want to answer. I think, but this goes back to governance and partnerships with other countries. I think we're missing opportunities to reach out to other countries and make space more accessible to them. One of the examples I used in class today was when SpaceX launched its Dragon capsule and we were able to basically put somebody in space for a third of the price of what we were paying Soyuz. We could have used that money to sponsor other countries to put somebody in space. And we're doing a little bit of that, but I think we could have done more. Made it more accessible, not necessarily to the American public, but to our partners and allies so that they have more of a stake in space and that they see themselves as more of partners rather than just second-class citizens or second-class allies. But I think what's probably coming, and maybe the science folks up here, the tech folks up here can answer better than me, is space tourism, space hospitality, those kinds of things that on the one hand, they make it more accessible to the American public. On the flip side, does it create more of a wealth gap, right? Or is it still only accessible to the middle class and there's still a handful of a large population that isn't able to access that? I think that's a potential risk.
Yeah, and I feel like there's honestly such a retrospect in, like, you had to think about different factors in that sort of sense of travel, and there's definitely, like, marginalization in terms of, like, oh, who gets to travel or who gets this sort of opportunity, and I think there's a need for a bigger talk in that sort of sense and, like, drive for initiatives from allies and from, like, people who come from higher sense of power in that sense. But thank you for the answer on your question, and also thank you to the panelists for doing such a wonderful job on that panel.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yash. I'm a student here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and my question is, space and satellite capabilities have played a key role in the war in Ukraine, whether that's Starlink use, jamming and spoofing, or some other commercial capability. What are some of the lessons learned from commercial space use in Ukraine, and what is the growing role of space situational awareness as we see more proliferated constellations?
Well, I'll start a little bit here. I brought a cover page of an online report. Hopefully, I can encourage some of you to read. It does have the picture of the moon on it, but DIA released a report in 2019, then again in 2022, called "The Challenges to Security in Space." So, if you wonder why we have a space force, I recommend that you read this. You Google it: Defense Intelligence Agency Challenges to Security in Space. Commercial space is helping us overcome these challenges to security in space because of the proliferation of what they're doing. Starlink as an example. The fact that we can commercially have thousands of satellites. I'm a Starlink user. If you have a van or an RV like I do, it's great capability. It's in beta, as you can know, but to have 50 megabits anywhere on the planet, whenever you want, on demand, is impressive. To be able to use that then to communicate to other folks around. I can make a cell phone call on that system because my Apple cell phone does cell over Wi-Fi, and so I can do a cell phone call over that. Same thing for putting data around and command and control around. So add the fact that you mentioned Starlink, but there are other commercial systems out there providing commercial data that's helping us understand the environment around us. A company called Hawkeye 360, which is collecting RF emissions from the ground and letting people know where are GPS jammers, for an example. Many companies doing electro-optical imagery. The first images that came out of Ukraine when the Russians went into Kyiv was Maxar images of this 30-mile-long trail. So 30-mile-long trails. All of that has been profoundly impactful because it made the Washington Post as well. So look at the commercial industry. Those images went on the Washington Post when they were certainly classified ones that did not. So not only is it having a profound impact on sort of military operations, it's also helpful for, I think, communicating what's going on in that world.
Just real briefly, I think it also highlights, getting back to the issue of risk, that when you have something like Starlink that is providing commercial service but can also be used for military purposes, that makes it a target, in legal sense, a legitimate target. And so there's a danger in those kinds of dual-use technologies that I think we're trying to encourage for a variety of beneficial reasons. But again, this goes back to the unintended consequences.
Okay, so with that, we're actually going to wrap it up right now, but I want to encourage the three people that we left stranded to come and talk to us on stage and in the coffee break, and we'll answer your guys' questions offline. I just want to reiterate again something that Patrick said. We only had 90 minutes here today. This is one of the hottest topics in all of space exploration, so we tried to bite off a small piece of it. When we go to forums like Space Symposium and other international forums, this is the biggest topic that's happening and that people are talking about, both from the national security and civil space perspective. And one of the things that we didn't get into today was the opportunity that it presents. And historically, exploring space and developing new technologies for space has benefited humankind and the quality of life in immense ways. And we have that same opportunity space here in this cislunar domain. But it requires us to develop the right technologies, to be responsible with those technologies, and of course, tackle this critical legal piece related to governance with all of this. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to the panelists. Great job.